My name is Ed Cottam, and I'm the author of a brand new book on Juneteenth called Juneteenth, The Story Behind the Celebration. And we're standing here in front of the United States Custom House, which was completed in 1861. The building was originally planned by the Treasury Department, which was in charge of customs and collecting customs, and they decided to build this building. It was historic on many levels. It was the first building in Galveston that was ever designed by a professional architect. It was the first non-military building that the federal government ever built in Texas. And in fact, this building has more important connections to the Civil War in Texas than any other building I know. When the Treasury Department decided to build this building, there was one element that they really lacked, and that was professional engineers. And so they went to the one element of the federal government that really had professional engineers, and that was the United States Army. And as it turned out, the Secretary of War at that time was Jefferson Davis, the future president of the Confederacy. Davis agreed to lend some engineers to the project, and the first engineer was a man named Alexander Bowman. Bowman picked the site for this building, and he would later go on to become quite famous, and he would become the superintendent of the military academy at West Point during the Civil War. The second engineer who worked on this project from the Army was a man named Major Robert Anderson. And Anderson would go on to become extremely famous in the Civil War because he was in charge of Fort Sumter at Charleston, South Carolina in 1861 when the Confederates attacked. Anderson's job was to supervise the construction of the ironwork that's on this building, which was a very important thing and really a novelty in Texas at the time. The third engineer who was in charge of the actual on-site construction of the building was a man named Captain Walter H. Stevens. And Stevens would go on to become a brigadier general on the Confederate side and would become the last uniformed Confederate officer to evacuate Richmond in April 1865 when that city finally surrendered to the Union forces under General Grant. This building has a lot of important Civil War connections, but you know, the real question in the Civil War was whose flag would ultimately rise and be carried on top of this building. Because when the building was constructed in 1861, it was literally on the eve of the Civil War. The contractor turned the keys of the completed building over where they were immediately seized by the Confederates, and the first flag that flew over this building was the Confederate flag. That lasted for a while, but finally in October of 1862, a Union naval force entered Galveston Harbor and the city surrendered. The commander of the forces came over here to the Custom House, and the United States flag was raised over the Custom House for the first time. But that was not to last. In a battle called the Battle of Galveston that was fought here on January 1 of 1863, the Confederates recaptured Galveston, and once again, the Confederate flag was raised over the United States Custom House. Incidentally, there is a monument to the Battle of Galveston that stands over here on the northeast part of the property that is the official Texas Historical Commission marker for that battle. And there are gunshots and shell holes from the artillery on a lot of parts of this particular building. Finally, in June of 1865, the Union will take control of Galveston once again after the Confederate surrender. And Captain Benjamin H. Sands of the Union Navy will march over here with a large crowd and watch the United States flag finally fly over this Custom House. He said it was very pleasant duty because he considered raising the flag here the closing act of the Great Rebellion. Galveston was the last major port to surrender from Confederate control to Union, and Texas was essentially the last major piece of Confederate territory to come back into the Union. Which brings us to the subject of Juneteenth and General Gordon Granger's arrival on June 19th of 1865. When he arrived here in Galveston, it was a very complicated situation, very chaotic, and he quickly took over a series of office buildings to serve as major parts of his headquarters. One of those buildings was the United States Custom House, which quickly turned into a major hub of Union activity. When the Juneteenth order was issued on June 19th of 1865, Copies were printed, and one of those copies was undoubtedly displayed here near the front door of the Custom House, where today there is a replica of the Emancipation Proclamation. This building also probably has another important connection to the Juneteenth order, and that is that this building, because it had been a Confederate office building, still had a functioning printing press. And so what the Union did was take that printing press and use it to print out thousands of copies of what were called amnesty oaths. And Confederate soldiers would have to sign those amnesty oaths in order to have their rights restored under the new government. And one of the provisions of those amnesty oaths was that the person who signed would honor all the laws of the United States government, including the elimination of slavery and the Emancipation Proclamation. One other very interesting connection to Juneteenth is that these printing presses in this building were probably used for a very important project. And that is that they were used to print multiple copies of the Juneteenth order, probably thousands of them. One of those copies still survives in the collection of the Dallas Historical Society today. And those papers were posted at places like here in the Reedy Chapel in the Osterman Building and all over Galveston, and then they were circulated throughout the state of Texas as soldiers went out on the railroads to spread the word of Juneteenth and the Union occupation of Texas. Those papers were then read by overseers, army officers, former masters to enslaved people, and they were the freedom papers that many of these enslaved people always remembered as being part of the source of their emancipation. There is increasing recognition of Galveston's important place in American Civil War history, and there's also increasing recognition of the important part that Galveston played in Juneteenth and the incredible number of events that will flow from that event. When I first started studying Juneteenth, there were not very many people outside of Texas that knew what it was. There were a lot of people in Texas that didn't know what it was. Today, that focus is changing, and Galveston is helping to tell the Juneteenth story in a very important and essential part. Today, there's an official historical marker, or 22nd and Strand for Juneteenth. Today, there is a beautiful mural that encapsulates many of the things we know about the events of June 19th. And this is an important part of Galveston's story, Texas' story, and America's story. And I urge everyone to really reach out and learn about it and spread the news to other people around you, because this is a critical part of our American history that we all share and appreciate.